Sorry, I'm just the screen here. Oh, there we go. Okay. Okay, so I was looking through this and I found a summary actually at the back. I think that's of one thing. We're going to go back to it. Sorry, wait a second. Sorry, wait a second. Sorry about this. I lost it. I didn't mark the place because it was Shabbos. I didn't have a marker.
Gavin's got a mark.
Gavin? Yeah, I know. Gavin's got a marker. Okay, it's basically. Oh, there we go. Partnership with a non-Jew. Gavin's son makes his mark every day. Okay. Okay, so it says Shulchan Aruch rules that it is permitted for a Jew and a non-Jew to form a business partnership if they stipulate at the outset that the Shabbos work is totally under the non-Jew's jurisdiction. Under the non-Jewish jurisdiction. That only he is responsible for the work on Shabbos, and that he is the sole recipient of that income. In compensation, the Jewish partner will receive the profits of a corresponding weekday. Entering into such an agreement is permitted even lechatchila, as long as the details are recorded in a contract form and not made merely as a verbal agreement between the parties. Mishnah Berurah adds that at the end of the accounting period, they are unable or unwilling to determine, if they are unwilling or unable to determine the respective profits and losses of each day, they may divide the profits and losses equally. It is important to stress that the leniency may be relied upon in the exact situation described by the Mishnah Berurah, that they were unable or unwilling to determine the daily profits when the time for accounting came. But if the business was set up in a manner in which it would be impossible to determine the profits and losses of each day, then it is evident that the entire agreement is a hoax and not valid. Okay, we can continue that. Okay, let me just, yeah, we'll continue next time.
Okay, Kev, thanks, man. Much appreciated. All right, guys, we're on 66b3, and just to encapsulate what we said in the last phrase, Rabba said, R-A-V-A, Rabba challenged Rav Yosef with this problem for 22 years, and it was not resolved until Rav Yosef, upon the death of Rabba, sat at the head of the academy and resolved it. So what are we actually talking about here? Is that Rabba was the head of the academy of Pumbedisa for 22 years and was succeeded upon his death by Rav Yosef. Now, Rabba had been unusually sharp. He was a genius like Mozart. Should I say Mozart was a genius like Rabba, without the moral compunction like that Rabba had, but also a genius. And he was unusually sharp and analytical, and he was referred to as an uproot of mountains. Whereas Rav Yosef was known for his diligence, his great breadth of knowledge of the Tanaic and Amoraic teaching. Not that he was stupid, he was extremely intelligent, but he didn't obviously possess that genius that's around in one in 10 generation. And he was referred to as Sinai because of the work that he put in. He actually learned and memorized the great breadth of knowledge from the Tanaim and Amoraim. So even Rav Yosef was a giant, but you obviously can't compete with, he couldn't compete with Rabba in the same level. So what happened is when Rabba passed away, Rav Yosef took over. And at that time, when he became Rosh Yeshiva, he got divine assistance from Hashem in resolving certain long-term standing difficulties. There were miracles that happened at the time, they were hidden. But one of the miracles is that he, through Ruach HaKodesh, was able to perceive certain gifts that he never had before. The reason is that he had to have his reputation enhanced, in order that everybody would look at him and take advice from him, since Rabba was no longer alive. So what conclusion, how did he resolve it? He said a change of name is the same as a physical change. So just like a physical change, we learned that a stolen article affects acquisition. It is from a rabbinic point of view by the thief. Now, it doesn't mean the thief gets away with it. If you remember, the thief has to pay the financial equivalent. And many sources say that as far as the article is concerned, if it's still in existence, he has to return it. It's only when a physical change took place, it's no longer in existence, that you've got no choice but to pay the financial equivalent. So a physical change, also a name change, also has an effect for certain reasons. Now, what's the reason that a physical change affects acquisition, guys? If you remember, because we learned it from a pasuk, he must return that which was stolen, that he stole. Remember that word that he stole came to say that it wasn't the original article, he had to make compensation, that he had to return, if possible, the original article. Now, if you look at what is the reason that a physical change affects acquisition, because in that case, the stolen article, for example, was originally wood, and now it's become a utensil. In other words, it's no longer the original article. It doesn't even resemble it. So therefore, the Torah's commandment for the thief to return the stolen article itself is no longer even applicable. Okay? So what's happening there is, we used the example of the hide. Originally, they called it an animal hide, and now they called it a tray. Why? Or a mat. That it still didn't make any physical change, but the name changed. But ostensibly, if you took an animal hide and you put articles in it and walked around with it, it would almost work like a tray, or you put on the floor, it would work as a mat. But not that it really had a major change. And we said even if there were slight alterations in terms of aesthetic, if it didn't change the functionality, it's not considered a significant change. So the Gemara is now challenging Rav Yosef's assertion that a change of title or change of name affects acquisition. So the Gemara says, but in the case of a stolen crossbeam that the thief built into a mansion, where there's a change of name, for originally before the thief built it into the mansion, it was called a crossbeam, and now it's called a ceiling. So as far as that's concerned, once he covered it with a layer of slats and put some plaster around it, it's now part of the ceiling itself. Now, just a point to note is that Rav Yosef was arguing that the change of name is actually what affected the thief's acquisition of the hide. It wasn't the owner's despair itself. That's what Rashi brings together. That Rav Yosef's position never changed. It's just that the name change affected it, but not despair. It still holds that despair itself doesn't affect acquisition. So Tosfot's commentary on it is that if a change of name affects acquisition just like a physical change does, then why does the Mishnah make the thief or robber's acquisition of the hide dependent on the owner's despair? Because a physical change affects acquisition even without the owner's despair. But a change of name isn't considered, according to Tosfot, to be significant enough on its own to exist with change. It has to work in conjunction with the owner's despair. Does that make sense?
Say that again, please. Just repeat that.
Okay. So Tosfot has got a different opinion. He's saying that if you have a physical change that takes place, not a minor physical change, but say, for example, you've got wool and then you knit a jersey. If it's taken a huge physical change, you don't need the owner's despair. But if it's a change of name, Tosfot said a change of name isn't significant enough on its own to effect acquisition. In that case, he's saying that even Rav Yosef would say that you would need despair. But despair on its own is not effective. It has to come with some sort of physical change. In other words, Rabba said despair affects acquisition, whether or not there's a change. Change affects acquisition. Despair affects acquisition, independent of each other. Rav Yosef is saying that despair doesn't affect acquisition on its own, as long there has to be a physical change. it has to affect physical change in order that despair, because he doesn't hold by despair. Do you see that, Kev? Rav Yosef never held by despair affecting acquisition. He only ever held that there was a case of a physical change affecting acquisition. Rabba said that both despair or a physical change, either or, would affect acquisition. So Tosfot is saying here that the reason that Rav Yosef could have come to the conclusion that despair affects acquisition is only in regards to a name change as well, because a name change on its own isn't even significant enough to warrant a change of acquisition. Are you seeing what I'm saying, guys? Or you're not sure?
A name change doesn't affect the acquisition.
On its own. On its own. In other words, if I decide to name something different, it's not powerful enough on its own like a physical change. And therefore, in combination with despair, it's powerful enough, but not on its own. Whereas a physical change on its own, according to Rav Yosef, is powerful enough. It doesn't need despair. Despair on its own can't affect acquisition. Have I lost you guys? I'll give it back to me.
Despair doesn't affect acquisition. Despair on its own. It has to be despair plus the name, the change of name of the article.
Yeah.
So that means that it's doesn't affect. It means it still belongs to the original owner. Ownership doesn't transfer to the thief.
Okay. So originally Rabba was saying that he's not sure if it's a biblical enactment or rabbinic enactment that despair affects acquisition. If you want to say it's biblical, you would say just like the find of a lost object, that the original owner gave up and it acquires it, so too does a thief. But if a thief is caught, he has to pay back both what he stole as well as the penalty amounts. Okay? But it's definitely rabbinic. Why? To allow somebody to make the shuvah. Rav Yosef didn't agree. Neither did a buyer, if you remember, that despair affects acquisition. So it's saying that when Rav Yosef took over from Rabba in the as the Rosh Yeshiva and had divine understanding, he understood that despair does affect acquisition, but only with regards to a change in name. Despair on its own wasn't able to affect acquisition. In other words, he understood it a bit more from Rabba's point of view. Rabba said despair on its own can affect acquisition. We might not allow it to take place because we don't want to reward the thief. In other words, if the article does exist, he has to return the original article. But the point of it is, if it's not in existence, the despair allows him to make financial recompensation. Am I making any sense to you guys? Guys, I seem to have lost you tonight a bit.
No.
Probably just a bit tired. So the despair. Okay, there comes Arthur again.
Arthur?
Yeah. Sorry, I lost the sound. I couldn't hear you.
No, that's fine. Can you tell me what you understand about Rav Yosef so far?
Well, what I understood by you saying is changing the name doesn't affect it on its own. It's got to be with despair as well.
Okay.
Is that what I'm getting? Is
Um,
that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Even according to Rav Yosef's new understanding after 22 years. Yes, that's correct. So the Gemara is now going to bring up an issue with it, because it's saying, okay, if that's the case and the person stole a crossbeam and the thief built it into a home, it's now changed in name, because originally it was known as a crossbeam and now it's known as a ceiling. And then we learned in a Mishnah, which seems to contradict that. That Mishnah is in Gittin 55a, that basically what has to happen is a Rav Yochanan ben Kajeda testified concerning a stolen crossbeam, that the thief... Arthur?
We lost him again.
Arthur, what's going on?
I just dropped again. I logged back in. It took me out of the room for some reason.
Okay. All right, this is a bit disconcerting. So, in other words, a crossbeam that's built into a home is not called a crossbeam, it's called a ceiling. Because by the time you put a plaster on it, it doesn't resemble it. And yet the Mishnah in Gittin 55a doesn't agree. Rav Yochanan ben Gejeda testified concerning a stolen crossbeam that a thief built into a mansion, that the original owner takes only its value as compensation. But he may not force the thief to return the stolen crossbeam itself, because of an enactment that the rabbis instituted to assist those who wish to repent, who would find it very difficult to repent if they had to tear down the house in order just to retrieve a beam for its owner. So what it's saying is, under derisa, biblical law, one must return the stolen property itself if it's in existence, and the rabbis enacted it to allow the thief as a mechanism to pay the money rather than dismantling the house, because he knows he wouldn't do that. Therefore, he wouldn't be able to repent. Now, the reason he's not required to return the crossbeam has nothing to do with the change of name, guys. That's what this Gemara is bringing. It's actually because of the enactment to allow those that steal to repent by paying a financial equivalent. Because if it wasn't for that special enactment to assist those that wish to repent, it would have to go back to the original owner intact. And that's evidence in the fact that the name itself does not effect acquisition. Okay, so that's a question on Rav Yosef. So now Rav Yosef has to answer. But do you see the question the Gemara is asking Rav Yosef? Rav Yosef turned around and said, yes, the change of name is only significant, I agree, with despair itself, but not on its own. It's not like a physical change. And the Gemara says a change of name isn't that significant. The only reason why you don't have to return the crossbeam is nobody's going to smash the house down to return one crossbeam. So therefore the person couldn't do a teshuvah. So the rabbis enacted a way that he could do teshuvah by paying the financial equivalent, but it has nothing to do with the change of name from a beam to a ceiling. So what does Rav Yosef have to say about that? So Rav Yosef responds to the objection and says, in the case of a crossbeam, its original name remains with it even after it has been put to the ceiling. Even then, it's still called a crossbeam. Okay? So in other words, no change of name has occurred. You're just now calling it a ceiling, the material that goes within a ceiling. But if you want to know what goes in a ceiling, you can call a brick. It doesn't change. It might look like a ceiling. You might name the utility a ceiling, but it ain't a ceiling, it's brick. Same thing with a crossbeam. Does that make sense? So that's not indicative of a name change, because it was taught in a brisa regarding the prophet Ezekiel's vision of the future Beis Hamikdash. It's known, it says, I will show the tzalos of the temple. Okay? And these are the casings, and the ubim, these are the crossbeams. So what do we see from that? I'll just explain to you what that means. Ezekiel chapter 41, verse 26, the wooden frames that surround windows and the entrances and beams, the beams are basically now inserted into sockets that are built into the wall. And the sockets are lined with wooden frames so that the beam should be protected from the dampness of the stone wall. Okay? But then, as far as that's concerned, they're still referred to as crossbeams. That's Rav Yosef's proof. You might now call it a different structure, but if you look at that individual component, it's still known as a crossbeam. It's like when you speak to a person, you refer to them as Damon. Not this is, I'm speaking to the jawbone of Damon, or I'm speaking to the ear of Damon. I'm speaking to that. Happens to be, if you look in my ear, it's an ear. But it's still, if you separate it, hopefully nobody does it, it's still an ear. but it's still part of me. So it doesn't change its name. It's just seen in a different light. Now, Rav Zera's got a different answer as to why the crossbeams are not acquired by the thief on account of the change of name. Rav Zera says a change that is reversible in the case of the change in name does not constitute a change that affects acquisition. And how do we know that? If you remember, if you basically manage to take apart the ceiling and you take that component out and you give it back to the owner, what is it going to look like again? A crossbeam, right? So in that case, Gavin, if you remember the thing with Bava Kamma and Bava Hillel, with Deuteronomy, that Hashem doesn't accept a harlot's contribution, according to Bava Hillel, if you take olives and you make it olive oil, you'll never get it back to olives. That's a permanent change. Even whereas with a roof, or whatever the case may be, there are components within there. If you break it down, you still have bricks. It doesn't change its inherent structure. Can you see what I'm saying? So Rav Zera is saying anything that's a change in name, that if it's dismantled will go back to being what it was, isn't considered permanent. Does that make sense? So that's his view, which is actually a support for Rav Yosef. So the Gemara asks, but does even an irreversible change of a name constitute a change, which renders maybe a different item and thus affects acquisition? So the Gemara is saying, look, I hear what you say, that if you look at, so let's use a different example. Let's not use Gittin 55a. Let's look at a case where the change of name is actually permanent. Does that now affect acquisition along with despair, according to Rav Yosef? So the Gemara brings a different example, and I'll give you a little bit of a background. It's going to be discussing about how you can create a mikveh. Okay. Now, as you know, a mikveh is a body of standing water. Okay, which you can either use kalim, utensils, or people, or immersed to basically purify them of their tumah. It's the most easy description I can find. So in order for it to be effective, the mikveh must contain at least 40 se'ah of naturally gathered water, like rainwater, or like the ocean is considered a mikveh. Water that was contained in a vessel, known as mayim shu'uvain, that's like drawn water, or shu'uvain, is not fit for a mikveh. Why? Because it was manipulated by mankind from a different source and then dumped. Okay? So if you filled a mikveh with water drawn from a bucket, the mikveh is disqualified for you. Why? Because you've in fact used water that could in fact be tumid through the transfer process, and now you've put it in there. It never naturally accumulated. It's an immediate disqualification. So if you have 3 lugin or more of what you call manipulated water drawn from a bucket, or unnaturally gathered water, then what's going to happen is that if you add it to mikveh, that contains genuine, naturally gathered water. It contains all the water. So in other words, once you've got 40 se'ah of water, if you add water, in other words, if it's got the required amount, and you add water, you won't taint the mikveh. But if you've got, like, for example, 37, you add the 3 for the bucket, all the existing water becomes disqualified. And even when you remove that added water, it's still a problem because it's tainted. So then you've got to got to go again from scratch. So look, the bottom line of it is we're now talking about how do you kind of get natural water in. Do you dig a big ditch and hope there's a rain? Do you make a channel from the ocean? Like, what do you do to gather water? Do you make sure it gets at the bottom of the valley, etc.? Arthur, I love seeing the tochas of your cat. It just cheers me up no end. Right. All right. So what they used to do there is they used to basically have a case, a casing or a block of wood, and it was hollowed out to form a pipe. So originally it was called a block of wood. That was the original name, it was a block of wood. And now it's called a pipe. Why? Because you just had a block of wood that wasn't functional, and now we almost created like a funnel system where one of it goes out and it can condense and be focused in a certain area where you can start to channel the mikveh, the natural rain. It's now called a pipe because it's creating a functional plumbing direction. And it's taught in a brisa that if a pipe was first hollowed out of a block of wood and then attached to the ground, it disqualifies a mikveh if it's used to channel the water in the mikveh. Okay? In other words, because even though it's a pipe, it's considered a vessel, despite the fact that it's now attached to the ground. So what it's saying here is that even though the pipe is presently attached to the ground, it's still considered a vessel. So rainwater or river water that flows through it is deemed obviously disqualified if 3 legun or more fit into that water. But if you built it the other way around, in other words, you had the block of wood on the ground, from the ground it was attached, you then created the sort of funnel and the piping, and it was attached to the ground at the time, the block of wood, then it's not considered unnatural. And in that case, it would be okay. Okay. So in other words, if you first attach it to the ground, when it's still a block of wood, and then you hollow it out, it doesn't disqualify the mikveh if it's used to channel water, because that's considered part of the ground. Okay. But the name is still legally changed. Okay. So even if you first attached it to the ground and then hollowed it out, it should be disqualified. So this is what it's basically saying is, look, if you take a block of wood and you chisel it out and then you put it on the ground, it doesn't count because you've manipulated the water. Does that make sense? Guys, you froze for a sec.
Damon, so the issue is, it's like when you have the thing with schach. Schach has to be detached from the ground in order for it to be kosher. It's a similar thing.
It is a similar thing. It's exactly a similar thing.
If the water flows through this hollowed out wood and it's still attached, it's not. It's the water for the mikveh won't be kosher.
No, so you've got the principle right. There also.
Now you're frozen, Damon.
Can you see me now?
We can hear you. It's okay. We can see you, but you're frozen. But as long as the audio is good.
Okay, but can you see me now? Is something better?
You're not moving, but now we can see you.
I slapped the phone with the signal. All right, can you see me now? Gosh. Guys, can you see me?
Yeah.
It's frozen again.
And now?
But your audio is good. The audio is consistent, but the picture's not.
Now it's like a bad Chinese movie.
Now we see you.
Okay. All right. So
now you're in slow motion, Damon.
No, everything. The audio is not good either now.
And
Can you see me now? Guys?
Yeah, now you're fine.
All right. So this is the bottom line. If you make this block of wood, you take a block of wood and then you make a piping where you're channeling the wood. Say it's a huge block where you're taking the rainwater and you're funneling it into an area and you're putting that pipe in and you're manipulating natural rainwater to fall into a location. That's like taking a bucket of water manipulating. In that case, it's a problem. But something that flows from the ground like rainwater and channels itself, like you dig a ditch, it's natural rainwater, there's no problem. So what it's saying is if you put this block of wood in the ground and then start to customize it as a utensil or a plumbing or whatever the case may be, but it's still attached to the ground, you're not in breach rabbinically of building a kosher mikveh. So it has to be attached to the ground when you manipulate this block of wood to channel the water. Because just like if water gathered in the ground into a certain ditch, and that's kosher because it's rainwater, if it's gathered from the ground in a certain way, it's still kosher. So if you take a block of wood and you build your plumbing pipes from there, it's fine. It's absolutely fine. But you can't create a plumbing structure and then attach it to the ground because that's manipulated. It has to be from the ground when you've done the ditching or the manipulation or the water channeling, etc. Am I making sense to you guys? It has to be done within the ground.
It has to be detached from the ground.
No, the opposite. It has to be attached to the ground. Anything detached from the ground where you manipulate it and then attach it to the ground is deemed manipulated. And therefore, with man's intervention, it's like taking water from a bucket and putting it into a ditch. It's no good. Okay, again, in order to have a kosher mikveh, rainwater or ocean water has to go within a body of water by itself. Okay? So if I create a bucket and I throw it in, I'm breaking the laws of a mikveh. It's not allowed. If I'm creating a plumbing structure and then attaching it to the ground, it's manipulation. If I build a trench which gathers water or a water estuary from the ground, it's not manipulating because it's still gathered from the ground. So if you take that block of wood, lay it on the ground, and then start to carve everything to where the water falls into the ditch, that's considered part of the ground. It's only when it's detached from the ground that you can't reattach it to the ground. You can't take from the ground a block of wood, then manipulate it, then attach it to the ground. That's considered man's interference. But if you take the terrain, you take a block of wood, you do all your attachments to the ground, that's considered a kosher mikveh. And therefore, what it's saying is, Kev, what it's saying is it doesn't matter if you've taken a block of wood and you've made it a plumbing thing. It's now known as a pipe, a plumbing tool. Okay. In other words, it's no longer seen as a block of wood. It changed the name to a plumbing apparatus. Okay. So it's saying that it should be, in that particular case, a change of name should happens whether or not you attach it to the ground or not. In other words, it was a block of wood, it's now plumbing apparatus. What difference does it make if it's attached to the ground? Suddenly it's kosher when before you manipulated it, compared to being treif if you did the construction and then attached it to the ground. In other words, you've got to have this block of wood, carve everything while it's still attached to the ground, do your plumbing pipes, and it's kosher. So what it's saying is, in fact, there's still a change of name. It went from a block of wood to a plumbing pipe, which is coming to prove that a change of name isn't what affects acquisition, because in that particular case, you wouldn't be allowed to use the block of wood away, because it would be considered man's manipulation. It doesn't matter if it's attached to the ground after you start to do it or before. If the change of name affects acquisition, it means you've manipulated, you're not allowed to do it. So that's a proof that the change of name does not affect acquisition. That's a proof against it. That's what it's saying. In other words, with what it's saying is a pipe that one first hollowed out from a block of wood and you attached it to the ground, it disqualifies a mikveh if it's used to channel the water mikveh, because the pipe is considered a vessel despite the fact that it's now attached to the ground. But if you first attached it to the ground and then, while it was a block of wood, and then hollowed it out, it doesn't disqualify it as mikveh if it's used to channel water, because a pipe is considered part of the ground rather than a vessel. Now, if you want to say that a change of name is legally significant, then even if you first attached it to the ground and then hollowed it out, the mikveh should also be disqualified. On what grounds? Very simple. On the grounds that it's undergone a name change. It's now called a plumbing pipe, and it was considered a block of wood. So that's proving that irrespective of a name change, that has nothing to do with it's a significant legal matter or not in the case. Okay? And so the answer given, do you understand the question, guys? We've got like 2 minutes left. Do you understand the question? If you guys don't, ask me.
Yeah, I can't talk properly. I'm having a bit of a problem with my system. Can you hear me or not?
Yeah,
Yeah, clear. That's good.
It's good.
Better than it's
Can
been
you?
for a long time.
I can barely hear you guys. Something's wrong. It's not. I bought a new thing, but what happens is it's the headset earphone is working as opposed to the hands-free something for this. It's not coming on loud enough. I can't hear you guys so well. I've heard you not though, but I've just been battling a little bit because of this. My issue. Okay, so you can hear me. What was the question again? Sorry, because now I got distracted. I was telling you.
Do you understand the issue? Do you understand why this is a proof against name change being significant? Because in both cases, let me just put it to you like this: you've taken a block of wood.
Only a little bit of time left.
You've taken a block of wood and you've made a plumbing instrument, and it's now changed from a block of wood to a plumbing instrument to name. It can't be referred to a block of wood. You've stuck pipes all around it. So now anybody would see it as a change of name. It's a plumbing tool. From being a block of wood, it's a plumbing tool. Now, it wouldn't matter whether you attached it to the ground first and then did the manipulation of turning it into a plumbing tool, or turned it into a plumbing tool and then attached it to the ground. The change of name should make it significant the way to make the law the same. The very fact that it doesn't, and only if you attach it from the ground and then do the manipulation is kosher, because you haven't altered you haven't altered or manipulated it. The ground's done it technically. Then it's allowed. It proves that a change of name isn't what's significant. It's the actual action. So the Gemara is saying that this is a proof that a change of name doesn't have any really legal significance, like in this case, even though it's changed from a block of wood to a plumbing apparatus. So the Gemara answers that in this case it's different, because the law with respect to disqualification of water through drawing is different because it's of rabbinic origin. So instead, a change in name is legally significant, and even a block of wood that was first attached to the ground and then hollowed out into the pipe is technically still a vessel. But the law that drawn water disqualifies a mikveh is only rabbinic stringency, and the rabbis applied it to a vessel detached from the ground, not from a vessel that is attached to the ground. So all it's saying is that originally the Gemara thought that the reason that the Brisa differentiated between the first and second case is that in the first case, where the wood was hollowed into a pipe before it was attached to the ground, it was considered a vessel, whereas in the second case, the wood was first attached to the ground and then hollowed out. It's not considered a vessel. Now we learn that the Gemara has explained that hollowed wood is considered a vessel even in the Brisa's second case, and the reason that it doesn't disqualify mikvah in that second case is that the rabbis did not apply the rabbinic disqualification of drawn water to a vessel attached to the ground. And the same should hold true in Brisa's first case. So that's basically that the name doesn't have any significance as far as that's concerned, but when it's attached, when it was manipulated. So that was a proof seemingly against Rabbi